messy, lazy, reckless, scatty, a failure. Words are powerful, and I'd associated so many of these words with myself for years. I knew I was hardworking. I knew I would really try my hardest, but felt I was always missing out on that final hurdle. I'd miss out on the final grade in exams, even though I'd spent hours trying to retain the information. And I would overspend and be filled with so much guilt. This would lead me to try and overcompensate in a range of areas, telling myself that I would pour into my creative passions and projects to validate that I could be good. I would try to be the supportive, organized one in my friendship group, whilst dealing with all this internalized shame of not feeling like I was amounting to what I needed to be. I would spend my days like it was a treasure hunt, going from one unfinished task to the other, with no treasure at the end. A lifetime of good intentions, but feeling like I was failing to execute. In 2019, I read an article by the mental health advocate Penny Bell. She spoke about her mind feeling on overload, the exhaustion of beginning tasks, and constantly feeling physically and mentally overwhelmed. I read this article and I saw myself. She went on to say that she had ADHD. ADHD? Do I have ADHD? Isn't ADHD associated with disruptive and hyperactive schoolboys? That's not me. That's not my story. I've never seen anyone who looks like me with ADHD. I'd worked with marginalized communities for over 7 years, but still had to unpack my own internalized ableism. After a year-long NHS diagnosis process, I found out in September 2021 that I'd been masking ADHD my whole entire life. This led me on one hand feeling liberated, but on the other hand, it brought up feelings of anger, shame, and resentment at how long everything had taken to be revealed. And what exactly did this mean next? Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is a group of behavioral symptoms that includes inattentiveness, things like distractibility, poor concentration, and hyperactivity and impulsiveness, things like over-talking, hopefully not too much in this talk today, fidgeting and constantly being on the go. It affects 1.5 million people in the UK and affects people of all walks of life and all levels of intelligence. I have combined ADHD that includes all of the above. Like I said, rather than affecting your intelligence, it affects your behavior, the brain's executive function, things like working memory, organization, and self-regulating actions, which makes it quite hard when you're trying to memorize a 15-minute speech. So bear with me on this journey, and let's see how it goes. It's like that fly that's buzzing around that you can see and hear, but can't seem to swat away. That constant, ongoing, worrying thoughts that can make it tiring to do anything. The psychologist Karen Young says it best. An ADHD brain is like a high-performing and brilliant sports car, but without the brakes. Figures show that men are 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than women. But why? ADHD is not gender biased. ADHD appears in men and women in the same proportions. However, the current clinical existing diagnosis that looks into ADHD seems to be based on research that is predominantly biased to white cis hetero men and boys. Largely, girls do not conform to this clinical picture. Women are more likely to show signs of inattentive ADHD. So things like trouble concentrating or paying attention to detail or forgetfulness can often be seen as more of personality traits or character flaws in women, as opposed to it being ADHD. Women are often socialized to assimilate, to conform, to kind of be in the background, and they often develop coping mechanisms to deal with their ADHD, which means often it's not paid attention to. Often it's when they get into independent learning spaces like university or the working world or motherhood, where they have to kind of take control of their own structure, is when it can feel like things become unsustainable. Research into this shows that when women have find out about their ADHD and have more self-compassion and self-understanding for themselves when they do find out about their ADHD. And research also shows that women are more likely to forgive themselves for past mistakes when they do find out about their ADHD. Then, when we kind of look at deeper into intersection and think about race and gender, this presents a unique experience for women who look like me. Black women have to think about structural racism and discrimination. Figures recently showed that Black women with ADHD are screening very high and positive for ADHD and are finding out about it later in life, over the age of 16. Why is this the case? Why are so many Black women finding out about their ADHD later on in life? Who's paying attention to them? Who's thinking about their needs? Engaging with a range of Black girls and women, along with thinking about my own personal experiences, there's definitely a lot to unravel. For instance, Black girls, are twice as likely to be expelled from school as their white counterparts, according to a report by Agenda. Often, teachers see disruptive behavior in Black girls and do not necessarily associate it with ADHD or behavioral symptoms. This means they're unlikely to get the support they need. And because of some of Black families' experiences in the education and health systems, they're more likely to have a distrust of these systems, which means sometimes they may minimize the experiences that their children are going through because they don't want them to be labeled as stupid or lazy. Then there's also the work twice as hard narrative. I'm not sure if anyone's heard of this before, but as a Black British Ghanaian, I know that's something I can relate to, and I'm sure many can from Black immigrant families. The idea that you have to work twice as harder. With this often instilled in young Black girls' heads that they need to work twice as hard to receive half as much as their white counterparts. This can often mean that they just feel like they're not working hard enough. I constantly felt that. I must be lazy. I'm not pushing myself hard enough. I need to do better. So much of these cultural pressures placed on Black girls and women to be nurturers, to be domesticated, to be strong, to have it all together. So much of this can lead to burnout. And then, once we also look at the healthcare system, we see that there's often a lot of gaps in supporting Black young women. Because of some of these assumptions made, like I said, for them to be strong, it often means that there's a minimization and dismissal of Black women's needs. And this can mean they're failing to get the support they need. Engaging with community groups and young women, I've heard lots of Black women's experiences of being told that they did too well in school to have ADHD, or their symptoms are not severe enough to have ADHD. I've also heard stories of Black women having to deal with covert discrimination and microaggressions when they did try to assert their authority. Microaggressions of being told that they're the angry Black woman. Instead, a lot of these women have said that they've been diagnosed with PTSD, bipolar, or anxiety, or if they did have these conditions, they're often exacerbated because of a lack of original ADHD diagnosis. This is really important. We need to make sure we're supporting Black women and hearing them and their needs. Who's listening to them? So when we think about this, I have 3 solutions to how we can make sure we are serving and supporting ADHD in Black women to make sure that they thrive instead of just have to survive. One of the first things I think is important is education and research. We need to make sure that educators and clinicians have an understanding of how ADHD presents itself differently in men and women, and make sure that they're also looking at the role that unconscious and conscious bias can play in identifying Black women's needs. There also needs to be more funding and research into this area to look into how ADHD manifests in Black girls with or without ADHD. And educational practitioners and organizations need to make sure that they're looking at their policies and guidelines at an intersectional lens to make sure they're thinking about all marginalized communities, including Black women. A second thing I think we need to consider is community and representation. Black families need to have safe spaces and communities to speak about ADHD and get a better understanding. There's so much knowledge and community groups out there. Organisations like ADHD Babes, that is an amazing support group for Black women and non-binary people that teaches them about ADHD, strategies and supports and advocates for them. And Black girls need to see representation. I never considered that I had something like ADHD because I'd never seen anyone that looked like me with ADHD. Knowing that there's incredibly capable and empowering women out there doing amazing things is so important. Women like Mel B, part of the biggest girl group of all time, has ADHD. Grammy Award-winning singer and songwriter, and also Beyoncé's little sister, Solange Knowles, has ADHD, and has said it's influenced her creativity. And the most decorated gymnast of all time, Simone Biles, you guessed it, also has ADHD, and talks about how it's incredibly important to empower young people from minority backgrounds to feel empowered in their ADHD. All these amazing women are pushing this, are breaking down the stigma and creating positive role models. Thirdly, we need to advocate and encourage Black girls and women to research, learn more about ADHD if they think they have it, and put on their self-advocacy capes. The NHS, the National Health System is currently facing unprecedented interest in women getting a late diagnosis for their ADHD. Online health verification tests showed that in 2019, 7,700 women looked into whether they thought they had ADHD. But in the height of the pandemic in 2021, this increased to 250,000 women, an increase of 3,200%. That means a lot of women now think they may have ADHD. But unfortunately, with this high demand, it's not feasible for all of them to go down the NHS diagnosis process. But not everyone is going to be able to have the funds to get a private diagnosis. So if you think you have ADHD, and you've done the research, you've looked at the articles, you've seen everything on social media and can relate to the symptoms, then your struggles are valid. Your self-diagnosis is valid. I was able to gain my eventual official NHS diagnosis because I'd done this research and advocated for myself. And if you do choose to eventually go down the path of getting an ADHD diagnosis, then I would suggest write down everything you felt, all your experiences through your childhood up until your adulthood, and how you think your ADHD has evolved. There may be some practitioners who invalidate your experiences, but trust in yourself, your knowledge. So to conclude, as I think about the last year since I've had my diagnosis, there's definitely a lot to process. It almost feels like a bereavement, kind of going through all the stages of grief, of who I thought I was, the denial, the anger at how long everything has taken to be realized. But I feel like I'm finally getting to that acceptance stage. I'm so proud of all I've achieved, in spite and because of my ADHD. So I'd like to wrap up with a love letter to myself, my younger self, but also to all the beautiful young women out there. All the young women out there and older women who spent a lifetime trying to seek answers for themselves, feeling like they're always trying to do their best, a lifetime of good intentions, but feeling like they're failing to execute. I know it may feel like you don't understand yourself. And let's go back. I know it sometimes feels like the world doesn't understand you. You often don't understand you. But your brain is beautiful. It's your gift. You will find ways to work with it. Once you learn to work with your brain and not against it, it will be your biggest asset. You are not broken, and you do not need to be fixed. Thank you.